Hello everybody, welcome to the Knights class. So for the first lecture I covered pretty common attacking motif, or a good one to know, the double bishop sacrifices. This next game I'm going to show is actually in the opposite direction. In this game between Keres and Smyslov from the famous Zurich 1953 tournament, this game was actually a must-win situation for Keres, who was playing white. And he goes for what you might call a kitchen sink attack, right? Throw everything in the kitchen sink at Smyslov. And as we're going to see, Smyslov keeps a cool head, doesn't ignore the attack, doesn't treat it carelessly, gives it all the respect it deserves, but nothing more. And Smyslov, after making sure that white's threats are covered, breaks through in the center, which has been abandoned while white goes for the kingside attack, and scores a key crushing victory, actually, to counter white's attack. So Keres starts off with c4. Pretty typical English. 3c5. Not going to talk too much about these moves. Both sides are developing pretty logically. White goes for another one of these fianchettos, these queenside fianchettos with the bishop. This is still seen a decent amount today. Nowadays, it's more common to bring the bishop out to g5 or f4 before you play e3, which I do think is generally more critical, but of course, this fianchetto is completely viable. Still seen some today, and was extremely popular for a long time. So the bishop comes to b2, black copies white, fianchettos their own bishop, d4, takes, and d5. Again, both sides are just developing. Castles, bishop b7. And if you were here for the previous class, the rookies class, you can see a lot of similarities, right? If black's bishop is on e7, and these pawns have already been traded, like black already took on d4, but the structure is pretty similar. And if you go through older games, especially classic older games, you'll see it a lot. So there's nothing... All right, the knight is crucially different. In the last game we looked at, this knight was on d2, which generally meant it wanted to head for f3 and e5. Here, though, the knight is more active on c3. It puts pressure on d5, but there's less direct play around the e5 square, right, because this bishop is blocked. So at the moment, there's nothing too direct to do. White has a bit of extra space, because this pawn is a little farther back. And one thing this pawn structure can lead to, it blocks this bishop out from this side of the board. So this is a common theme, especially in a lot of d4 openings, where this pawn stays on e6. So, also, for example, positions where you end up with a structure like this, for example. Black's pieces are kind of cut off by the kingside, from the kingside by the pawn structure, and this bishop has a nice diagonal towards h7. So here attacks, or ideas of attacking, are very common for white, and it's just because of how the pieces are. If we imagine that black could teleport this bishop to g6, it would be far more difficult for white to attack. Or, for example, if this pawn were on d5 and black instead brought this bishop out here. So this is just an example of how this pawn and piece structure decides the plans. So in the game, after rook c1, black leaves the pawn on d5 for the moment, plays rook c8. White plays rook e1, and putting the pieces on active squares, nothing too direct happening yet. And black goes for knight b4. So first of all, does white want this trade? What do we think? Yeah, definitely not, right? This especially in these positions where this bishop's over here. This is a key attacking piece for white. So unlike the last game we looked at, bishop b1 is what white wants to play. White wants the bishop on this diagonal. White wants the bishop here. But what's the problem with this? Why can't white just keep the bishop here and ask, why are you playing knight b4? So it's something direct. The bishop on d3 was actually doing something important. It isn't anymore. Right, s3. Yeah, so c4 is hanging. Right, because actually, ironically, because this knight's on c3, this pawn is actually undefended, and the bishop can't go to b1 because it was doing an important duty guarding this pawn. And this is why black played knight b4. And this is good to realize, because this is the difference between a pointless threat and a useful one. If white could just play bishop b1, at some point white would play a3, black has to go back, and white's happy enough to have this bishop here. White can go queen d3 next, after the knight comes back, and create many dangerous threats against the kingside. So the reason black goes knight b4 isn't just to randomly attack the bishop. It's because thanks to this c4 pressure, right? There's a reason black plays rook c8, and only after that plays knight b4. Because thanks to the pressure on this c4 pawn, white actually has to go bishop f1. So white's forcing this bishop to a square it doesn't really want to go to. But it's doing an important job, and it needs to keep doing that job. Right, s3, and as you mentioned, d takes also opens up this line for the bishop. Again, kind of like we saw in the last game. This game has a lot of similarities, but a very different outcome. So bishop f1, black immediately pounces on this weakened d4 square. And after a3, right, white wants to kick the knight out so the bishop can come back. Black uses this opportunity to trade off a pair of knights. Generally speaking, in these positions where white has these kingside attacking prospects, and not so much here, but oftentimes white will have the worst pawn structure. You know, something like an isolated pawn. Very often, black's happy with these minor piece trades, right? That's part of why black was dreaming of trading off this light square bishop, because the fewer of those pieces are left, the fewer prospects white has for attacking on the king side. Right? The more likely you are to be attacked, the happier you are trading off these pieces. Yeah. And you are right, s3. So after bishop takes c3, black would have knight a2. So this would attack the rook, and you can take the bishop and then take the pawn. So this is no good for white, and actually because of that, white is indeed forced to take with the rook instead. Which, normally, this rook feels a little awkward here, blocking the bishop. But we're going to see Keres had a distinct idea. So black goes back to c6. In this position, so I kind of touched on it. This was a very important game for the outcome of the tournament. This is Zurich 1953 tournament. It's a very famous one in history, by the way. It has a lot of great games, and David Bronstein wrote an excellent book about it that I highly recommend. And Keres went in with basically determined to win this game. And as we're going to see, commits all out to a kingside attack. That doesn't prove justified. And generally speaking, right, this is not the way you want to approach it. You want to say, yeah, right, Chess Thinker. The name of the book is actually just the tournament. I think it's Candidates 1953. Zurich Candidates 1953. But 19 times out of 20, maybe more, you just want to play good chess and find good plans and try to win from there. If the position calls for an attack, great, go for it. But when you're not well enough set up for an attack, as is the case here, I mean, the kingside's kind of open, but at the same time, white has very few pieces actually ready to attack. So in this position, I think a good plausible plan for white, and what I would like here is actually just c5. And the idea is you can establish a c5 pawn. Black does get a strong center, but if you play b4, b5, and c6, and this is not so simple to stop, you can create some crushing threats with these queenside pawns. So this, I think, would be a pretty logical way for white to improve their position. Just to press forward on the queenside and use what, once you play c5, it's basically a pawn majority. It's almost a 4-on-2, because it's these 6 pawns that are interacting. Instead of that, though, again, white decides to commit to an attack. So white goes knight e5. So black takes. If white takes here, right, black can take here, perhaps trade queens. And black's a little better because this pawn blunts the bishop. It's a little weak. Small advantage, but black is definitely for choice here. And of course, there's no attack, right? This is no way for white to try and win. So white's idea was instead to take with the rook. And after bishop f6, to go rook h5. Right, the upside here is that white can quickly generate threats on the h-file. The downside is, if white doesn't make something big happen with these threats, the center is going to be painfully underdefended because white's committing all their pieces over here. Right, if white doesn't make threats, this rook just looks silly. Now, first of all, just to establish white has serious threats, let's say black plays a random kind of useful developing move. Let's say queen d6. Can anyone find what's the quickest way for actually white to create a very strong attack here? And this is very direct. Now, rook h3 would be the right idea, but it's more forcing. Right, more direct. Just take on h7. King has to take. Just go queen h5 check. And rook h3. I mean, black's close to being mated on the spot. Anyone actually see what is the only way for black to avoid immediate mate here? We've got 2 checkmate threats. Yeah, g6 is the classic way to cover a queen h8 mate threat, but you also have to cover queen h7. Yeah, this kind of thing is dangerous, and you do have to know how to respond to it. Right? You definitely don't want to ignore a threat like this, or an attack like this. Yeah, so bishop h4, white takes with the rook. And right, Trevejo, f6. The king can escape here, but in exchange for what is now a small material investment, right? White has a bishop and a pawn for a rook. In exchange for a small material investment, white's generating some huge threats. I'm not going to go too much into the specifics. You know, white can try and bring the other bishop in, etc. But suffice to say, this would be very, very dangerous for black. This is a defensive idea to be aware of, though. Just generally speaking, again, I talked about it a bit in the last lecture. This f6 is basically the one way to avoid an h-file mate, like this. It's a good defensive idea to know. But okay, so Smyslov sees this coming and plays g6 first. All right, so now rook h7 just doesn't work because there's no queen h5. And the bishop is ready to help on the defense. So you can see we're not ignoring the attack or anything. But we're also going to see that black also carries out his own ideas. And this is really the way to respond to an attack like this. I mean, step one really is to stay calm, right? It's obviously dangerous. You know, obviously if an attack like this works, you're in big trouble. But all the same, you just have to work out as best you can how to respond to it and how much you need to respond to it. And again, I know this is easier said than done. But you want to respond only as much as is necessary. So white goes rook h3. Now the first question to ask, this can be a very difficult question, is can we be greedy and take this rook? And this is something you should ask, right? If your opponent is sacrificing a rook, you should at least consider taking it. And black does have a tempting continuation here to take. Queen takes. And how might we try and escape here for black? You could do bishop h4 and queen h4. That would escape the mate. But we're down a lot of material now. So if we're going to do this, we definitely should not take the rook in the first place. There is this tempting idea rook e8. And so no doubt Smyslov considered this. But here, white actually has a very clever move. So first of all, at first it even looks promising. If white goes queen h7, black's just running to e7. It's not a dream square for a king, but when you're up a rook, you're prepared to make certain concessions. But Keres had a very clever idea in mind here. And his move was actually just to play a4. And this move looks absolutely crazy, right? You're attacking on the king side and you play a4 on the queen side. Queen h6. So queen h6 comes into play. Right. Bishop a8. The whole point is white wants to play bishop a3. And just cut off the king's escape. Yeah, and these lines are very tricky. I'm not going to go into them in depth because it's just a lot of analysis. But suffice to say that Smyslov correctly judged that if he accepted this rook sacrifice, white's attack is very, very dangerous. Yeah, and queen h6 is also in the air in those lines as well. So actually, in this position, Smyslov kind of realized something. That to checkmate, white actually needs the queen. Right? If white plays rook takes h7, the rook's not going to checkmate the king. How do you build this large board division? So I would say the way to learn about things like this is honestly to look at games like this and to play a lot of games. Because, right, queen h6 is also a move I would consider. Generally speaking, in this specific case, it's pretty clear that there's no way for black to cover the h7, right? Black's not going to salvage this h-file. Black's one plan is to bring the king out this way. So then the question is, okay, what can we do about that? And if white had a knight, if white could get a knight to f5 or in some other way cover e7, really the question is, as white, what can we do to stop the king from running this way? And a4 is something that's easy to miss. And things like this get missed all the time, even by strong players, even by grandmasters. But that's sort of where it comes in, right? This bishop can cover this. And it's actually the ideal piece, because it can cover all of these. But generally speaking, I would say this is the kind of thing, right? You learn about something like this from seeing a game like this and from looking at the variations. In this case, I'm talking less about the specifics and more about the general correct conclusion that Smyslov reached, that allowing this queen to h5 was not worth it. Right? Accepting this sacrifice is not worthwhile. So instead, as is often correct, Smyslov responds to a kingside attack by going for his own play in the center. And he plays a very nice high-level move. He takes on c4. In this move, right, this move might seem irrelevant at first, but it does a couple things. First of all, let's say white just takes the pawn back, right? Let's say first white just covers the center. So we've opened up this bishop. Can anyone see, what can we do now? Because this bishop now has freedom to move. Specifically, because this bishop can come to e4 now, black has something very specific in mind. Right. Yeah, this bishop can cover h7. Yep. A couple of you got it. Very nice. We can take the rook, because now after queen takes, now we don't have to run with our king anymore. We can just cover h7 with the bishop. And this is a case where you absolutely should jump on this sacrifice, because now you can cover the one mating threat white has. And actually here, now that there's no queen h7 mate, white has no way to break through. And you do have to check, right? You don't just want to assume this, but white has no way to add pieces to the attack. And sure enough, actually here, this attack just does not work. So this is what I mean when I say, right, you want this ideal of you give the attack respect when it deserves it. But if something like this doesn't work, it's very, very important to take advantage of that fact. And to see ideas like this bishop e4. Because if you don't take on h5, right, that's a whole potential rook you're giving up. But okay, when Smyslov takes on c4, right, Keres sees this idea that the bishop will cover the mate threats, and he rescues his rook. He takes on h7. Yeah, at the same time, though, is white making a big threat on the king side? Is white about to checkmate us? So maybe, right, yeah, the rooks, white doesn't have enough support. So let's ask this, how can we improve our position? Yeah, this bishop is doing excellent defensive work. Yeah, only if white removes the bishop from f6. We do need to keep an eye on this piece. But okay, so that being said, as black, we've realized, at least for the moment, white's not threatening anything crushing. How can we get some play of our own? How can we create some of our own threats? Because there's a nice move here where black starts creating some problems for white. Right. Yep. Got it. c3. So this rook's trying to attack, but that also means it's overloaded, right? White can't take this pawn. If white takes, black takes, and again, overloaded. And meanwhile, if white doesn't take, we now have a passed pawn on the 6th rank without a whole lot of defenders in front of it. And so now Keres goes queen c1. Okay, so first of all, the mere fact that white goes here, offering to allow you to take this bishop, that should at least set off a warning in your head. That white's got something in mind. Whether or not it works, we should check for ourselves. But what does white want to do here? What's white's goal? What's he thinking? Right, yeah, queen h6. So white wants to play queen h6, bring the queen in the attack, and checkmate us from there. So now let's say, all right, let's try the greedy route. Let's say we try and take this bishop. White goes queen h6. White's threatening rook h8 with mate, so the second queen won't do us a lot of good. All right, material advantage doesn't matter if you're getting mated. So can we take the bishop, and after queen h6, can we try and defend h8? What if we go queen takes d4? So are we covering the mate threat? Can white resign? I'm loading these questions a bit, but all right, these are the things that's important to consider. Right. Very good. Yeah, this is a key attacking idea. And this is just something you should be aware of. You want to consider, you want to get, by studying games, some experience with these patterns. And you also want to think, especially when there's a lineup like this, you want to think very carefully. And sure enough, rook g7. Rook h8 also works. Black takes. There's no mate on h8, but queen h7. And once again, we're up mountains of material, but we're getting mated, so it doesn't matter. Okay, so white's threats are serious now. Queen h6, followed by mate on h8, or a sacrifice and a mate on h7. And so this is what Smyslov had to see. How to handle this. So let's ask this. The queen can cover the mate on h8. The queen can cover the mate on h8. How can we escape the mate on h7? G5 would prevent queen h6. Generally speaking, I'm not a huge fan of moving pawns in front of the king like this. Let's see, what would happen here? I don't see an immediate refutation for white, but there is actually a move that covers threats more directly. Let's see. Yeah, I'm seeing some interesting suggestions, actually. Yeah, bishop g5 is... I mean, at a minimum, it leaves these uncovered. Yeah, these are all moves you should consider. g5, like I said, is a bit riskier because it leaves h7 open. These moves might... Bishop g5 might work as well. Preventing queen h6 is very valuable. So the only thing I'm going to say is, like, these are good moves to consider, but Smyslov actually found a defensive setup that's even better. Smyslov... Smyslov found a way to cover all these mate threats, while at the same time generating some threats of his own. So he actually took on d4 first. And the idea is, white goes queen h6, so the h8 mate is covered. And a couple of you touched on this already, actually. How do you cover this rook sack and queen h7 mate idea? Right, the h8 mate has been defended. How do we defend against the h7 mate? Right. h7 is not mate if f8 is open. So you play queen d4. And then you play rook fd8. So h8 has been covered adequately by the bishop and queen. Now this check. And queen h7 is no longer mate because the king runs. And again, this is what I mean by giving the attack just as much attention as it deserves. No more, no less. Right? This rook h8, queen h7 idea, when white plays queen c1, this aiming for a mate on h7 is very, very dangerous. We certainly don't want to ignore it. Right? If we take on b2 and white promotes, or sorry, white goes queen h6, and we take, or whatever we do, if we try to promote, this is a very tragic end. So we don't just want to ignore things altogether. At the same time, if you see a defense like this that looks strong to you, that looks like it holds everything, and at the same time, right, we've won this nice d4 pawn. This c3 pawn's an absolute monster, right? I've mostly been talking about this kingside attack. But look at the center, right? If white does not checkmate here, white's getting absolutely demolished on the rest of the board. Black's made some very useful progress here. So that's what I mean by striking the right balance, right? If black hadn't bothered to make progress here and had been purely defensive, their position wouldn't be nearly as good. And this is true in chess in general. It's not just when you're being attacked. Right? You want to give your opponent's plans as much respect as they deserve, no more, no less. And of course, easier said than done, but you should aim to do it. And right, learn from everyone makes errors in judgment sometimes. So you might miss this rook h8 and queen h7. But okay, then you learn from that and you address it next time. But here, though, as we'll see, white doesn't really have a follow-up. Right? There's no mate on the h-file. So these pieces are all just kind of stuck in the middle of nowhere. Right, knowing what deserves respect is the hard part. Yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of experience, and like I said, no one does it perfectly. But if you, I would say more if you look carefully, if you're playing a game and you look at a position like this and you don't see a way white can checkmate, right? By your best judgment, white has no way of breaking through and punishing this, then I would say you should play it. Right? You should play what looks strongest to you. If you make an error in judgment, and you will sometimes, then you learn from that and you adjust. But if you avoid something like this, even though you don't see anything, you're going to get in the habit of playing scared chess and not making the most of your position. And you can find plenty of players on both extremes, right? The ones that attack nonstop, even when it's not justified, and the ones that defend against far too many threats, especially when they're playing up. So rook g3 and sacrifice on g6 for white. Let's see, so rook g3, I mean, this is a move worth considering. So let's apply this principle here. Right? White has this idea of rook g6. But okay, let's ask ourselves first, what happens after rook takes g6? Black takes, white has ideas of checkmate. But then what if we go bishop g7? Does white have a mate there? And if white does, I don't see it. So this is an example of what I'm talking about. If you really wanted to defend, if you decided you needed to defend, bishop e4, for instance, would be a move I'd consider to defend here, right? To cover g6. But given that I don't see a win for white after rook g3, So actually, I don't see any reason we can't just take this bishop and get our queen. Because I think we've staved off white's attack. And you do have to be careful, right? You have to consider rook g6 and rook f7 carefully. But after rook g6, fg6, queen g6, bishop g7, I mean, black's king is open, but white simply doesn't have enough pieces. Right, and as far as I see, this attack is completely stopped. Another thing white can try is rook f7. Again, trying to break open the king. But after takes, check, king here, queen h7. So white can try this. You definitely don't want to go back here because that's mate. But after king d6, we're up an enormous amount of material. And white just, again, white lacks the firepower. So this is what I'm talking about in action. Rook g3 is worth considering. Yeah, you're right. So in this position, yeah, white does have rook d3. Well, it's a good pin to notice, but we're up so much material, it doesn't matter. We're already up a rook and bishop. So it wins the queen, but I mean, the simplest way would actually just be to take. And this b2 pawn, right? We have two rooks and a bishop for a queen. This pawn is going to win us the game. A more aggressive way, and what looks strongest. I mean, so this is a good move to see, right? It wins the queen, but that's just not enough. White's invested so much into this that you can do rook c1. And if white wants the queen, white can have it. We're going to get a new one. And again, this all merits thinking about. All right, resignable at that point, I would say, especially once black gets the new queen. This all merits thinking about, but it's very important not to get in the habit of avoiding positions like this as black, just because it looks dangerous. It is dangerous. But if there's nothing there, then there's nothing there. And after rook g3, we can safely take the bishop. So rook d8, and white kind of realized this. White realized the attack was losing steam and just saved the bishop. Of course, playing a move like this when you're attacking is never a great sign. Black goes bishop g7 to kick the queen out. Queen g5, and queen f6. And again, if you're playing queen g5, queen g4, and bishop c1 when you're trying to attack, it's usually a sign that things went wrong somewhere. And okay, now, what should we do as black now? All right, we've kind of staved off this attack. What's the next step? Yeah, bishop g5 is an idea. We should keep that in mind. Right, just c2. Yeah, c2 is the simplest. Yeah, we just want to play rook d1, and we're just promoting our pawn, right? We have a passed pawn on the 7th rank. You don't usually see this kind of passed pawn at this stage of the game, but so much the better. So rook d1 is a huge threat. Yeah, if white plays bishop g5, white can try this to go for an attack, but my first inclination here is just to actually give up one of the queens. Maybe just promote. You always want to check on rook h8 and such, but white's only getting one of the queens back, and black's up a piece. Not only that, but this is coming. So instead of that, white goes bishop e2 to cover the threat to d1. Black goes rook d4. And this is an elegant finish, right? If the queen moves away from d1 like this ends the game. Checkmate. So instead, white goes f4 to keep the queen on g4. Now one last combination to end the game. Oh, good call, s3. Yeah, you're right. That is actually just a direct checkmate with a queen sack. That is even stronger. Yeah, nice catch. Right. So now white's still covering d1, but he's also opened this diagonal. So rook d1 check, bishop takes, and queen d4. Very nice. Yep. Checking the king, and whatever white's next move is, we're going to get ourselves a second queen. And here white resigned. Let's see. Rook takes f4. Well, so rook d1 just wins. Right, rook d1, queen d4 is going to get us a new queen. But after rook f4, the problem is the bishop covers it. So I think after queen f4, it's not so clear. And even this should be good for black, because you're winning the bishop. But it's not nearly as good as rook d1. Because this just lets us promote. Right? We're not even winning a piece for a new queen, we're just getting a new queen. And winning a bishop at the same time. And here white resigned. I think a very instructive game, right? We saw white had some genuine threats, and black gave those their due. Black covered the h8 mates and the h7 mates. But when black had their chance, right, Smyslov pushed his pawn to c2 and just created monstrous threats in the center that white was unable to answer, right? A big part of why this pawn was so strong is all these white pieces are over here. Thanks, Alberto. Good to see you. Yeah, so I think an excellent defensive game from Smyslov. And a great example, too, of how defense does not mean only defending. Right, you cover the mate threats, you cover the serious threats, but when the threats stop, you also go for your own play. Can white play e3? I mean, yeah, white can move a piece to e3, but this is with check. Black's going to be up a queen in a moment. And actually, white's also just getting mated in a couple moves. So there's just no move that defends against this second queen. All right, so we don't have enough time to cover this second game. This second game I was interested in, but actually, this being the Knights class, let me do honor to the name and show a couple Knight puzzles. This one's a bit of a favorite of mine. All right, so here's this position is white to play and mate in 2. Like I said, so we don't have too much time, so let me show off some knights for the Knights class. Nice. I see we have some experienced puzzle solvers here who know to look at the queen sack first. All right, queen takes f8 is tempting. I mean, of course, in a game, queen takes f8 would be a completely reasonable way to win quickly. But the way to mate in 2 is actually, yeah, queen d7. Knight takes, and knight e6 checkmate. Very nice. Yeah. And if you do a lot of puzzles, you'll see this pattern again. This kind of checkmate. Yeah, it's a very nice final position. Right. In a game, right, there's absolutely nothing wrong with playing queen takes f8 in a game. It is fun to try and see where the mate is. All right, this next position, this is actually the end position. This is right near the end of a much longer study that is a very nice puzzle. But just to finish it up here, this is white to play and win. Right. Normally, this is a winning material advantage. Normally, bishop and 2 knights against bishop is a win. But the problem here is black is threatening to just win one of our knights. And if black can do that or trade off the bishops, then it's a draw. So what can we do as white here? So knight g8 is an idea. If king g6 or king g7, right, knight takes, king takes, and we have the bishop and knight win. So check. If we can just trade the knight for the bishop, then we have our win. But hang on, what if king h5? The problem with knight g8 is king h5, and black still wants to trade off the bishops. Very nice chess thinker. So knight g8, king h5. And they say 2 knights against a king is a draw, but here's one of a very few exceptions. Knight f3 checkmate. And we have another 2 knights mate. All right, so what about king g6? So that's, of course, that's a move. The key here is after king g6, we take the bishop. And of course, this is not a simple checkmate, but it is a winning position for white. It's a good one. It's worth knowing too, I would say. Oh, so after taking, well, king here takes, well, king g6 now, right, we have ourselves a winning endgame again, something like this. But the key here is that, yeah, I know the bishop and knight mate is not easy. It's been messed up at high level more than once. But it's doable. I've had to do it myself a few times, actually. Yeah, again, black can't take the bishop, and if black goes back, we keep a winning amount of material. All right. Yeah, nice solving, guys. Actually, both. I thought especially this second one especially is a little sneaky. So that was a quick solve. Yeah, I mean, if you're playing black and you see this checkmate and you trust your opponent, I'd say it's absolutely worth it, right? Test them. Make them actually win this endgame. So as I said, it is not simple. But as far as the study is concerned, we can certainly say this is a one position for white with absolute confidence. And as I said, well, it's tricky. Once you know the technique, it's definitely doable. Yeah, perhaps I'll actually talk about that in a future lecture, because like I said, I've had to do it a few times. All right, guys, so I'm going to wrap up with that. The other game I mentioned I can cover next week. So yeah, thank you all for watching. I guess if you have any questions or comments as I wrap up, feel free to leave them in the chat. I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you at 5, Chess Thinker. So yeah, I'll be on Puzzler's Paradise on YouTube at 5 p.m. Central. So feel free to give that a look. And I hope to see you then. Yep, 5 Central on YouTube. Or for me, 3 p.m. Pacific. Right. Thanks again.